Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to talk about something I feel very passionate about, how we make decisions. I'm not really sure how long I've been thinking about how we make decisions, but I think it's something that really is important for all of us. My central thinking, though, is that we make decisions largely by instinct and intuition. We're not particularly rational. In fact, what I would say is that we're 21st century humans, but we really live in the Stone Age as far as decision-making is concerned. In the Stone Age, we didn't have to worry about thinking. What we had to do was survive. So when we saw something, the key decision really was it safe or was it dangerous? Was it something we could eat, or was it something that would eat us? Were they a friend, or were they a foe? And so we learned how to make decisions very, very quickly. And if we did it well, we survived, and if we didn't, we died. It was that simple. So we were either quick, or we were dead. So we really had to rely on intuition and instinct. And for the most part, it worked, at least in the Darwinian sense. You know, we got to the top of the food chain after all. But the problem is that intuition and instinct are often wrong. And the consequences can be significant. Decision-making is affected by biases. There's many, many biases. There's more than 40. And some of them we are quite familiar with. Overconfidence and groupthink are things that we think about all the time. But even the order in which we're given choice can make a difference, or the way that choices are characterized or framed will affect the way that we make decisions. And many of them operate concurrently. So I'd like to just give you a couple of illustrations. You know, it's interesting when we listen to the piano, and you'd like to think that assessing talent is relatively objective. But in the 1970s, women only made up less than 10% of the professional musicians. And towards the end of the 1970s, as professional orchestras moved towards blind auditions, where musicians would play their instruments behind a curtain, the probability that a woman would be selected increased by 50% if it was blind, or if there was a blind element in the selection process. And the probability that a woman would ultimately be selected increased by about 3 times. So clearly there was some bias going on. And this research, by the way, was really, really well done. The advice, for example, that was given to female musicians when they would approach their instruments behind the screens was to take off their shoes so that they wouldn't give away their identity. Here's an example from Nobel Prize-winning Danny Kahneman's excellent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful but with little interest in people or the world of reality, a meek and tidy soul. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. This is a rhetorical question, but I'd like you to just think for a second. Is Steve more likely to be a farmer or a librarian? So I'll give you just a few seconds to think. After all, we're actually not living in the Stone Age. I ask people this question very often. In fact, I asked this question earlier this week, and the split was about 55-45 in terms of percentages. So clearly, this definition applies to both. I'm not sure what you've picked. Your decision may be based on the meanings that you ascribe to the words that I've used. Perhaps you know a farmer, perhaps you know a librarian, perhaps you know somebody by the name of Steve. But maybe he looks like one of these people. But let's take a look at what the data says. In the United States, there's about 212,000 librarians, and they're 83% female. So there's about 36,000 male librarians. There's about 3.4 million farmers, and they're about 30% female. So there's about 2.3 million male farmers. So there's 64 male farmers for every male librarian. Now, I don't know Steve, and I can't tell you whether he's a librarian or a farmer. But what I can tell you is that if you think he's a librarian, you think he's 64 times more likely to be a librarian than the data suggests. My last example is probably one of the most famous cases of cognition bias in decision-making, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, of course, in January 28 of 1986. The underlying issue, the problem with the space shuttle, of course, was that the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters didn't do well in cold temperatures. They were not pliable. So in a cold launch, the Challenger blew up, obviously traumatic consequences. Of the 24 launches that had occurred up until that date, all of them were the average temperature was 70 degrees. And so NASA was well aware that launching in cold temperatures was not safe. The temperature that day, by the way, was 32 Fahrenheit for Americans, and of course 0 for Canadians. NASA wanted to make a data-driven decision. This, after all, is rocket science. So what they did is they talked to the Morton Thiokol folks, the guys that actually made the solid rocket boosters, and they produced this beautiful diagram. And it shows the 24 launches. It graphically illustrates each of the boosters on the left and the right side of the shuttle, 12 on the top, 12 on the bottom. Again, it's a beautiful picture. The nose cone shows the ambient temperature that day, and the visual indicators that you see on each of the solid rocket boosters are the amount of damage. The problem with this picture, though, is that it's cognitively taxing. It's very hard to understand what it needs to tell us, and it doesn't actually show the relationship between temperature and the solid rocket booster damage. The 17 launches that have no damage and the single launch above 80 degrees that had a little damage obscure the 6 launches where the damage was quite significant. So Yale's Edward Tufte, an expert in the visual display of quantitative information, suggests that if we'd shown the data this way instead, we might have been able to make a less biased decision. On the horizontal, what we show is the temperature, and on the vertical, we show the amount of damage. And what we do is we graph the best fit or regression line. And if you look towards the left side of the screen, which is the regression, you can see the predicted day shows a 99% probability of traumatic failure, catastrophic loss. Clearly, if they'd looked at this picture, they wouldn't have made the launch decision. The folks at NASA clearly cared about the crew. They wanted to make a good decision. The problem was that the way they looked at the data was biased, and what they would have once considered to be unthinkable slowly became acceptable. I don't want to suggest that intuition and instinct are not useful or important, but of course they are. But the situation is that we're no longer talking about immediate survival in terms of fight or flight. What we're talking about is the need to make far more sophisticated and nuanced decisions. And what I would suggest is that the decision-making apparatus that we used to use is no longer really what our dominant strategy should be. Relying on instinct, intuition, and thinking about bias is yesterday's apparatus, and we need to do things differently if we want to tackle the problems of today and tomorrow. I thank you very much.